just coming back in again. He's
Now, Dotty, you and David work together? If I got
so
that
David,
right, or-
I'll just give you a little background. David, it's just totally coincidentally, David and I both have condos up in Eastman. And yeah, and so we both graduated from Columbia Journalism School in 1969, and we both got involved in this book that we wrote a couple years ago. And so we did a class, it wasn't a class, we did a lecture at Eastman in the fall of, let me think about this, 2020 maybe.
It was the summer of 20, yeah.
For the summer of 20. Yeah, hi David. We're just doing a little advanced chat here. People ask how we know each other. And so we did that, and then Osher asked us to do a class the following January, which was January of 21. And was it last January, David?
Oh, it was last January.
Last January, yeah. So I guess our first talk was in 21.
21, right.
Summer
right.
of 21, and then January of 22, we did an Osher class, and you don't have to do this, but we did get rave reviews. So they asked us to do it again. So that's why we're here. Actually, this class is being taped. David will talk about, I guess, for an Osher program in Connecticut. Is that right, David?
I think so. It's community television or something.
Yeah. So there's some kind of new program that Dartmouth Osher is working on being more collaborative. Anyway, we have a little more time before we start here. Do you have any other advanced questions for us?
We'll have some time at the end for questions, and
Yeah.
so we'll talk about that.
Does anybody else have a journalism background here? Raise your hand or unmute. Or
does high school count?
sure.
We very well with we went to the Columbia Journalism the high school thing, and we did our paper was highly rated, and those of us in the journalism class saw Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which as a junior or a senior in high school, one or the other, was pretty shocking. And we went to the opera too, and it was wonderful. But I'm definitely a better writer from having done that. And certainly I'm aware now when I read so many things, and I learned those rules about journalistic writing, and I just see how things have changed.
Great.
They have changed a little bit.
A little bit.
Okay. Should we've got 15 people, I guess a few people still coming in. I don't know.
Yeah,
Dave,
I think we
heads?
can start in, and if they're latecomers, they'll just join in. I'd like to welcome everyone. Actually, looks like we have a nice sized group here, and it's going to allow for some discussion later on. I'm David Gumpert. I'm joined by Dotty Brown, and very briefly, just to kind of repeat a little bit, Dotty spent much of her journalism career as a reporter and editor at the Philadelphia Bulletin and the Philadelphia Inquirer. I was a reporter with the Wall Street Journal and an editor at the Harvard Business Review and Inc. magazine. And we've each written or helped write several books, which are detailed on Amazon. One of the books is the book whose cover you see here, or you will be seeing here very shortly. It's called Inside the Upheaval in Journalism. And you'll learn a little bit more about our backgrounds as we discuss the highlights and lowlights of the media over the last 50 years.
David, I guess I'm not in screen share, or am I?
Not yet. You
Okay,
were.
I was. Hold on, let me see if I can find this here. Here we go.
There we go. So as I was mentioning, we each helped write this book, The Inside the Upheaval of Journalism. Reporters look back on 50 years of covering the news. So just a few housekeeping matters. We're going to be recording this session so it can be available on community cable television. I'm going to assume that everyone is fairly familiar with Zoom. If questions come up as we're talking, you can write them down in the chat section, which is at the bottom. And we'll try to get to them either during the class or in a chat back to you. And we've also left some time at the end for discussion and questions. Finally, that we're going to have a brief bio break about halfway through our presentation. So now I'll invite you all to enter a time capsule that you see kind of drawn here, and within a couple of hours, you will have covered a lot of ground. 50 years of massive upheaval in America's media. We'll be exploring 6 main topics. 1, why we decided as alums of Columbia Journalism School to write a book tracing the upheaval in journalism. 2, what we witnessed as journalists working for mainstream media outlets over the last 50 years. 3, how the newspaper business model unraveled under a variety of pressures the industry was unprepared for. 4, how an assortment of innovative new platforms has emerged to replace newspapers. 5, recent trends in how we get news. And finally, we want to explore with you ideas and approaches for being efficient and effective news consumers. So because we're journalists, first and foremost, we'll be asking each other probing questions as we move along here about the who, what, why, when, and where of the upheaval in journalism. So Dotty, I have a question for you. Why, after so many years since we graduated Columbia in 1969, did members of our class decide to write a book tracing the media's upheaval?
So this is our Columbia Journalism School class of 1969. I am second from the left in the front row, and David, I think, is either 4th or 5th from the left in the second row.
I haven't changed a bit, so you'd be able to spot me.
Yeah. Anyway, our journalism class was unusual. We started out in the fall of 1968 at a time when the country was reeling. That spring, the Reverend Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then Bobby Kennedy was killed. Urban rebellions were happening around the country, and students were protesting the Vietnam War. We were 101 young people hoping to create a better world. It wasn't surprising that we bonded, and we continued to do so over the next 50 years through a very early listserv that was set up. When a Chilean member of our class fell ill and lost his job, some of us helped him get back on his feet. When the husband of a Haitian journalist, Michel Montas Dominique, was assassinated, we rushed to give her support. And when biographer Lawrence Leamer, who has written about the famous rich and famous, including residents of Palm Springs and Mar-a-Lago, when he wrote a play about Rose Kennedy, about 40 members of the class went to the performance in New York. Besides experiencing the rise and fall of newspapers, we were in the vanguard of a push to diversify the press, both by gender and by race. We lived through a technological upheaval, going from manual typewriters and hot lead type to the World Wide Web. So when it came time for our 50th reunion, I hate to say that it's that long ago, but anyway, someone on our listserv proposed a book to recount this historic time. Thus was born Inside the Upheaval of Journalism. Reporters look back on 50 years of covering the news. More than a dozen of us who had spent our careers in journalism took on chapters to report on how news coverage had changed in such areas as business, technology, race, politics, international reporting, crime, medicine, and religion. Beyond that, we wanted to describe the fall of newspapers and the rise of digital with all the upheaval that had caused. I wrote the chapter on the experience of women journalists as well as the coverage of women's issues. I also volunteered to co-edit the book because of my years as an editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. David went into business reporting, first at the Wall Street Journal, and later his career path changed, which he'll tell you about. And somehow it all came together. Here we are in the apartment of one of our New York classmates, plotting the book. I'm in the front row. Where am I? Once again. And David is in the second row all the way on the right. Yeah, I'm in the middle on the front row with a name tag on me. Anyway, today we'll be drawing on the experience of some of our classmates as well as an examination of what the world of media looks like today and the repercussions on our understanding of what is news. David, what did the world of journalism look like back in 1969 when we were starting our careers?
It can be difficult to appreciate in today's chaotic media world of Twitter feeds, blogs, hundreds of cable channels, and endless user-created content, just how orderly, structured, and predictable things were back then. Each morning you read your morning city paper delivered by a newsboy, often on his bicycle. Each evening you watched national news on one of three networks, CBS, NBC, ABC. Every evening, more than 30 million Americans tuned in to watch the CBS news anchor, Walter Cronkite, pictured here, and about the same number tuned in to watch the news on ABC and NBC. Each week, you read Time or Newsweek magazines. And if you were a really serious student of the news, you read the New York Times, which very humbly billed itself as all the news that's fit to print. If you were a serious investor or corporate executive, you also read the Wall Street Journal. The situation was similar in the budding world of television entertainment. For those of you who've seen the movie On Being the Ricardos, there's a scene early on where a producer of I Love Lucy is recalling what a huge event each weekly half-hour show was. Life around the US kind of came to a halt on Monday evenings as 90 million people tuned in to watch I Love Lucy. Today, you're lucky to see between 5 and 10 million tuning in to the national news or a popular show. Each city had 2 or 3 newspapers. They came out in editions throughout the day. When you went off on vacation or off to college, one of your biggest problems was filling the void of not having your local paper each morning.
Oops, sorry. Sorry.
It's all right. A prominent retailer in the Boston area in those days was a kiosk, some of you may remember, in the middle of Harvard Square, known as Out-of-Town News. It stocked dozens of, many dozens of daily newspapers from around the country, actually even from around the world. It was the go-to place for thousands of college students in the Boston areas who were starved for news from back home. It's also difficult today to imagine just how dominant metropolitan newspapers were. Before I went off to Columbia Journalism School in 1969, I worked for one of those papers, the Chicago Daily News of blessed memory, in a job that also no longer exists. I was a copy boy. One of my jobs was to go down to the main floor where the printing presses were located and pick up the latest issue of the paper. There were 3 or 4 issues each day. Those printing presses were huge, as you can see from the photo here. They went up 2 or 3 floors. They made a racket, big racket, printing and folding the papers. But I always loved the smell of the ink on the fresh papers as they came bundled off the presses. My job was to distribute the papers throughout the 8-story building, which you see on the left here, overlooking the Chicago River. And I distributed them to dozens and dozens of reporters, editors, advertising salespeople, and executives. Now, those newspapers were extremely profitable, generating profit margins of 20% or more. How do they do that? As they say in business school, there's nothing like having no competition. Where else could advertisers go for citywide exposure? What limited the competition was that very few business people or journalists could afford the many millions it cost for those huge printing presses you saw in the previous slide. It was a great business, so long as competitors were priced out of the market. Yeah, those were great days to be a journalist. Publishers were flush with cash to hire reporters and editors. Reporters were heroes. Reporting was romanticized. We all know about Superman's great feats, but it's easy to forget that Superman's disguised character, Clark Kent, was the mild-mannered reporter with the Daily Planet. So were his closest friends, Lois Lane and cub reporter Jimmy Olsen. Reality followed fiction in the early 1970s, when Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein exposed Richard Nixon's cover-up of a political burglary at the Watergate Hotel and became instant folk heroes. After the book and movie, All the President's Men, a lot of kids wanted to do what they did. So they filled journalism schools, as did we. So Dotty, what did you find when you graduated from Columbia? Tell us something about the changes you experienced.
So my first newspaper job out of journalism school was at the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin. I'm going to tell you about it in some depth because what happened at the Bulletin mirrors what happened around the country, and I watched it happen. In its heyday, the Bulletin was the largest circulation afternoon newspaper in the country, selling 741,000 daily papers in 1947. Its motto, in fact, was nearly everyone reads the Bulletin, which Ben Shahn parodied in this painting, which is from 1946, about the same time. The Bulletin was still considered the newspaper of record in Philadelphia when I got there in 1972. A bit dull, still, it was a newspaper you trusted. But the Philadelphia Inquirer, the morning newspaper, had recently been bought by the Knight Ridder newspaper chain, and it was aggressively trying to win circulation and advertising from the Bulletin. This is what my newsroom looked like back then, although this is a photo from the New York Times. Almost no women worked covering hard news. I think there was one woman on the Bulletin's Metro staff, but women did dominate the features department, where my first job was a food writer. And we all made less money than the men, who were secretly allowed by the city editor to pad their expense accounts with fake lunches. But women began to make headway in the 1970s, which was true around the country. For instance, my colleague at the Bulletin, Dee Eisenberg, who was covering home and design in the features section, was asked by the editor if she wanted to be a sports writer, because at the staff football games, the touch football games at his house, she could throw a mean pass. For instance, my colleague at the Bulletin, excuse me, she became one of the first women sports writers in the country. Of course, she was not allowed in the locker rooms after the games where the male reporters could go. And she would have to wait until 2 or 3 in the morning sometimes for the men to emerge so she could interview them. Later, after Dee won access to locker rooms, the athletes would sometimes drop their towels in front of her just to upset her. Once on live TV, a sportscaster asked her, "Are you an athletic supporter?" She told me she kept what she called a discrimination file in case she ever wrote a book about it, which sadly she did not. This is me with my firstborn in this picture. As for trying to juggle work and family, I know some of you experienced what I did. At the Bulletin, when my daughter was born in 1974, I worked until I went into labor, never missing a day. There was no such thing as paid maternity leave at the time. I got $30 a week in so-called sick pay after the baby was born and was back at work in 3 weeks. I was, in fact, the first woman at the Bulletin to have a baby and return to work. Our daughters today, and our sons for that matter, have no clue that paid maternity leave only became a possibility in 1978 when Congress passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. It required companies to cover maternity-related disabilities like other medical conditions. Of course, I was going to do it all. I raced to work after nursing at 9 a.m., leaving my daughter to get a midday bottle from the babysitter. Then I raced home in time for the next breastfeeding. It was nuts. I was convinced that if I took any time off, my job would not be there for me, let alone my burgeoning career. As for women readers, editors of the Bulletin knew that women were critical to circulation. Their readership studies showed that 52% of readers were women. I watched as the male newspaper executives did little to hold on to this important segment of readership. For one, during the 1970s, newspapers got rid of their women's sections. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Women's Lib was in full flower, and women's sections were seen as marginalizing women. They implied that women were not interested in hard news. Women also were arguing that some of the stories in the feature sections reflected big national issues and rightfully belonged in the first section of the newspaper, like stories on the struggles of two-career households, the benefits of or the harm of putting children into daycare, breast cancer, the right to abortion. Remember, Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973. Also that year, Congress passed Title IX, requiring schools to provide equity in funding to men and women. And in 1974, Betty Ford went public with her breast cancer. So all around the country, newspapers got rid of their women's sections and gave the new sections gender-neutral names like Style or Tropic. Who did they choose to oversee those new feature sections? Well, men, of course. No matter that the women who had run those sections had been ordering up edgy stories on the issues I just mentioned, they were moved aside. The paper's thinking was that only men could make sure that the new content would appeal to men as well as women. Why am I telling you all of this? Because newspapers timed the changes badly. Women readers who are entering the workforce in large numbers and still carrying the workload of running their households had little time left for a newspaper, especially one that had cut back on stories of special interest to them. The defection of women was a major part of the circulation slide that newspapers began to experience. But other forces were also at work, especially the decimation of the industrial workforce, as jobs first went to the American South and then overseas. Those workers typically, the blue collar workers who, before their jobs were lost, typically would get home around 4 p.m. and pick up the afternoon paper. In 1961, 80% of adults in the US had read a newspaper the day before, which is how they did the survey. By 1998, that number was down to 59%. And that was a time when the internet was barely catching on. By 2012, only 29% of American adults were reading a newspaper, either in print or online. Over my career, I experienced this tsunami. In 1982, the Philadelphia Bulletin folded. All across the country, afternoon newspapers were dying in the 1980s, leaving most cities with just one newspaper. I was 35 when the Bulletin folded and luckily got hired by the Philadelphia Inquirer. I said to myself back then that newspapers would last my career, but not much longer. After killing off the Bulletin, Knight Ridder rewarded the Inquirer with foreign bureaus. It also added about a half dozen so-called neighbors sections to give various suburbs in-depth local news in an effort to kill off the suburban dailies that ring the city. For a while, it remained a cash cow, but the Inquirer never picked up the Bulletin readers. Their habit was broken. They likely turned to TV or radio. And here you can see the circulation numbers of the Philadelphia Inquirer starting in shortly after the Bulletin was killed, which was in 1981, and going down to 2019. And I just checked circulation now, and it is even lower than the 100,000. In the late 1990s, the editor of the Inquirer asked me to serve on a committee with the heads of circulation and advertising, among others. The idea was to come up with a 5-year strategic plan for the Inquirer. It was just then that the internet was taking off. Working with a professor of business from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, we came up with 2 likely scenarios for the future of the Inquirer. One we called hectic days, where we'd have to hustle to become digitally savvy in order to make it easy for advertisers to place ads digitally and readers to read the paper online. Remember, this was 1999. The other scenario we called internet rules. We envisioned the possibility that circulation would plummet. In this case, we would have to rethink our business model. But just then, the internet bubble burst on Wall Street, and the owner of the Inquirer, which is the Knight Ridder, must have breathed a sigh of relief, and they failed to make the changes we recommended. In 2006, a faltering Knight Ridder sold off all its papers, including the Miami Herald, the San Jose Mercury News, the Costa Contra Times. I know somebody in our classes worked there. And in Philadelphia, a group of local businessmen bought the Inquirer. They declared bankruptcy a few years later, and the paper was sold to a hedge fund. Then it was sold again to a group of local business leaders for a mere 10% of its 2006 sales price. Where once the Inquirer had 800 reporters, photographers, news editors, and copy editors, today they have about 225. So David, what was your experience during those years?
Well, here I am at work back in the 1970s, pounding away on a manual typewriter in the Boston office of the Wall Street Journal. And that was the tool of our craft back then. Our office administrator had an IBM electric typewriter, but reporters were tough guys and gals. And so we stayed with manual typewriters. There were no cell phones or internet or even fax machines. We communicated by telephone. Part of my job was to feed information about corporate earnings and annual meetings to something called the Dow Jones News Service, which was part of the Wall Street Journal. And that came through on ticker tapes into brokerage offices around the country. Our big competitor was Reuters News Service. Now, there was a guy in Boston who worked for Reuters whom I'd see at corporate meetings. And when companies released information at an annual meeting of, say, Polaroid or Raytheon, we would engage in a little foot race for the phone to get the information on the wire. This would sometimes get a little dicey if there was only one payphone in the building. You would get demerits if Reuters got the story out a few seconds before Dow Jones did. When I was working as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in the 1970s, our other main competition besides Reuters was the New York Times. When I say competition, I mean competition even more serious than Reuters, because you could get fired if the New York Times had a story that you missed on your Wall Street Journal beat. While the Wall Street Journal was obsessing about the New York Times, There was all kinds of new competition taking shape, reporting on entrepreneurs and small business. The 1980s saw a wave of new publications spring up, magazines like Inc. and Entrepreneur and Crane's New York Business. They made celebrities of the colorful entrepreneurs who were starting these fast growth businesses. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, would appear on dozens of magazine covers over the years. One of the first being this cover here on the cover of Inc. magazine in 1981. The new competitive publications kept coming in the 1990s. Working Woman, Fortune Small Business, and Red Herring. Here you see Steve Jobs again on the right, now along with the rising political star, Hillary Clinton. By 2010, each of these magazines had disappeared, though, in the midst of massive changes that were overtaking all media, prime among them, the internet. Eventually, the established media's monopoly blinders could no longer obscure these bigger challenges. They were symbolized by the emergence in the mid and late 1990s of this cheesy-looking website called Craigslist, which systematically decimated the highly profitable classified ad business of big city papers. These were the ads millions of people placed to sell used cars and houses and to get jobs and rent apartments. Today, that competition is more sophisticated and entrenched. Sites like LinkedIn, Carvana, and Zillow. One of the last remaining income sources for metropolitan papers today is, ironically, obituaries. More broadly, the established media's gatekeeper role limited coverage of other big issues such as religion and spirituality and race. So Dotty, other members of our class who reported for the book also saw how newspapers failed to adjust to the changing world around them. Tell us a little bit about how this photo of a group of Hare Krishnas with Beatle George Harrison illustrates the problem.
So one of our classmates, who would later become editor of a California paper, the Monterey Herald, uses the phrase opportunities squandered when talking about areas of coverage that newspapers missed. One of those opportunities opportunities squandered, besides what David talked about in terms of small business, was a failure to report on the spiritual upheaval that was happening in the United States. Another classmate, Tammy Tanaka, wrote a chapter in our book called Covering the God Beat in a Time of Change. In it, Tammy explained how the religion writers working in big media in the 1970s and beyond focused their reporting on major religions, or they focused on the intersection of religion and politics, as in the debate over abortion rights or the religious aspects of terrorism. She worked at Religion News Service in the 1970s, and there her editor presciently put her on a beat that Tammy called the other. Many Americans were breaking away from mainstream religions and looking for spirituality in new places. The Beatles were probably the poster children for that trend, but newspapers weren't covering the underlying movement. As Tammy wrote, Americans were seeking spiritual fulfillment in new ways. So I began writing stories about religion in everyday life, features which attempted to understand the spiritual underpinning of an ever more diverse America. During the next 50 years, religion writers would face a vastly changing spiritual landscape as a predominantly Christian country transformed in what today is described as one of the most religiously diverse industrial nations in the world. Religion would come to encompass not only the major world faiths, but pantheism, agnosticism, atheism, secular humanism, mind-body-spirit groups, a feminist godhead, Eastern religions, a born-again awakening of charismatics and evangelicals, and the rise of the politically activist religious right. The Center for Media and Public Affairs analyzed media coverage of religion news between 1969 and 1998 at the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and other large news organizations, it found that 95% of religion stories contain no spiritual dimension. In 2011, the Pew Research Center for Journalism and Media did another large analysis of religion coverage. It concluded that when religion did make news, it was often because of accusations about extremism or intolerance. Over the decades, religious differences would become intertwined with political schisms, dividing America in ways that continue today. Most newspapers missed all of this. Quote, "The formation and growth of the religious right hasn't been clearly explained," close quote, the Pew Research Center concluded. So David, given all we were seeing in our own worlds, what was happening in newspaper reading habits around the country? Give us the national picture.
So as Dotty mentioned, we were at Columbia Journalism School. We were a close-knit class, and when we get together at reunions, we often talk about how we had the good fortune to work during a golden age of journalism in the U.S. But it couldn't and it wouldn't last because the financial underpinnings were coming undone. We saw how the mainstream media were screwing up by failing to cover small business, women, religion through the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. But it wasn't until the 1990s that all these oversights began showing up big time in circulation. Once the circulation erosion got going, though, the rate of decline just picked up steam through the 2000s. And that, of course, was when the impact of the internet and the World Wide Web were exploding on the scene and upending the news as we once knew it. While circulation is sliding, advertising is taking a nosedive into the 2000s. That's the internet at work. The classifieds that Craigslist was making off with were being repeated with display advertising. All that wonderful, unchallenged advertising from department stores and specialty retailers and restaurants, it was now moving quickly onto the internet, following the consumer and business migration online. So reduced revenues, quite logically, translates into reduced job opportunities. Here we see the graphics of the showing the erosion of employment in newspaper newsrooms, some 26% between 2008 and 2020. So this is really a continuation of a decline that was set in motion 20 years earlier with a decline in circulation and in advertising revenue. So the three previous slides that you saw about declining circulation, advertising, and employment helped create something called news deserts. Now, the best way for me to explain news deserts is to compare them with food deserts. We see food deserts in urban and suburban areas when there aren't enough food outlets in urban or suburban area to offering nutritious food choices. Food deserts are most common in poor areas of the country, or actually poor areas of cities and towns. The same principle applies to news. Increasingly, we're seeing more areas of the country without a serious news outlet. You can see the decline in news outlets reflected here in graphic form from the University of North Carolina. Some 71 dailies and nearly 2,200 weekly papers closed or merged with other papers between 2004 and 2020. And the pandemic has just made things worse. Here is how a report from Northwestern University's School of Journalism put it just recently. Quote, between the pre-pandemic months of late 2019 and the end of May 2022, more than 360 newspapers closed, in addition to those shown on this slide. Since 2005, the country has lost more than 1/4 of its newspapers and is on track to lose 1/3 by 2025. Most of the communities that have lost newspapers do not get a print or digital replacement, leaving 70 million residents, or a fifth of the country's population, either living in an area with no local news organizations or one at risk with only one local news outlet and very limited access to critical news and information that can inform their everyday decisions and sustain grassroots democracy. About 7% of the nation's counties, or 211, now have no local newspaper. End of quote. There are many ramifications for these the decline in the number of papers around. The time was when every major metropolitan paper had a bureau in Washington and in its state capital, with reporters digging up information on how new legislation or political battles would affect the paper's hometown. As you can see from these graphics, such bureaus have become an endangered species, meaning that news organizations no longer offer meaningful information about what their state and national legislators are doing or not doing. So, Dotty, how did newspapers' plunging revenue, job cuts affect other things readers had come to expect from their daily paper, like international reporting? I know at the Inquirer, all those foreign bureaus are now gone.
Yeah, so this is a picture of one of our classmates, and also he contributed a little bit to the book, Terry Wolkerstorfer. Graduating as we did during the Vietnam War, several members of our class quickly got jobs as foreign correspondents. It was exciting, adventurous, and in Vietnam, they were covering the biggest story in the world. As Terry said, I believed in the American people's right to know what was going on. I thought I could help tell the truth. Another class member, Michelle Montes Dominique, was trying to do that in her own country, Haiti. She and her husband ran Radio Haiti, an independent voice in a time of dictatorship. Her husband, Jean Dominique, was assassinated in 2000. Michelle bravely carried on until 3 years later when her bodyguard was killed in an attempt on her life. She fled to the States, where she became spokesperson for the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. What happened to Jean Dominique has become far more common as more and more journalists are killed doing their jobs. So on the left here, you see Michelle in front of a poster honoring her husband. And on the right, you see her with Ban Ki-moon and President Clinton at a foreign event. It's dangerous now being a reporter in many corners of the world, and it's only getting more so. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, in 2021, 294 journalists were imprisoned worldwide. 28 were killed. So far this year, as of September 3rd, when the latest numbers came out, 29 journalists had been killed, including 2 Fox reporters in Ukraine. That's just one reason American news organizations, with the exception this year of Ukraine, have dramatically cut back staffs abroad over the recent years. It's also the cost, plus the fact that in general, the American public seems largely disinterested in foreign news. At least 20 US newspapers and other media outlets shut down their foreign bureaus between 1998 and 2011. And TV has done the same. CBS once had 16 foreign bureaus. As of 2019, it had 7. The Inquirer itself, after it killed off the Bulletin, had foreign bureaus in South Africa, the Soviet Union, China, Germany, and England, not to mention Washington, D.C., Wall Street, and California. Those bureaus are all gone. Instead, with the exception of covering dramatic events such as the war in Ukraine, most newspapers rely on the Associated Press to provide international news today. as well as relying on local stringers. But even though these citizen journalists, as they are called, understand the culture and language of their countries, it's not the same as having American eyes and ears abroad, interpreting foreign events and issues for an American audience. On the other hand, the internet has made it possible for those who have intense interest in foreign news and who have the time to learn a lot. But as Michelle Montas says, it is a serious undertaking that requires digging into digital editions of foreign media, blogs, and other sources that make their way to the web. And most people don't or won't have the time it now takes to be well informed about the world. David, do you think it's time maybe for a break?
Absolutely. We'll take a 5-minute bio break, and I would just encourage everyone to begin thinking about the discussion topic we mentioned. We'll take up at the end of how you are personally managing your consumption of the torrent of incoming news.
So 5 minutes, that would be about 1:20. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is everybody back?
Yes.
Okay. So in my last years at the Inquirer around 2010, 2011, the reporting staff was finally getting trained in how to post on social media and how to take photos on iPhones. Until then, our equipment was seriously outdated. Journalism schools had better computers than we did. But after we were bought by a hedge fund, we finally got new gear, and suddenly part of my job as a projects editor was how to organize staff training sessions, which is why I should know how to unmute myself better than I did. Anyway, when I took a buyout in 2011, I thought that starting a blog would be a fun way to keep up with my writing and continue to have a presence in the world of journalism. My blog was called Unretiring, and you can still find it at unretiring.blogspot.com. I was interviewing people about their transition from full-time work to what I call the next great thing, because that was an area that people were so worried about. I mention all this because I was just like thousands of others who were discovering that they didn't need to get hired by a news organization, and they didn't need to be trained as journalists, and they didn't need to be edited by anyone. And they could have a lot of fun and quite an ego trip hearing back from friends and strangers who were interested in what they had to say. David, you started a blog too, which you're going to talk about shortly. But first, can you give us some perspective on how the media has changed and how news consumption habits have shifted?
Yeah, so if you look at some new research on news distribution trends, you'll see that life has kind of been turned upside down. Newspapers, which once dominated our news information lives, are now barely visible on the graphic. And digital devices that didn't even exist in the late 1960s and 1970s and early are now dominate. So we've gone from that nice, simple news life I described at the start of our class, where you watch one local TV or news radio station, your favorite network news show, read the same local paper each day, to a multitude of cable TV stations, a multitude of social media platforms, from Facebook to Twitter to Nextdoor, which has local news as micro as missing dogs and minor vandalism. And then there are blogs, podcasts, news feeds that you can subscribe to or which are emailed to you based on your interests. Now, all of these are vying for as many eyeballs as possible and the ad or subscription revenues that come with it. So if you look at the graph here, showing the audience that TV news programs have today, you can see how cable news how cable has cut into the old ABC, NBC, CBS news programs, with Fox winning the viewership battle. But that's not the whole story. ABC, CBS, and NBC are still major players. They just have a few more serious competitors. But even that's not the whole story. Another big part of the fragmentation story is the emergence of a whole new source of, quote, news, end quote, in the form of social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. Of course, it's not all news in the sense that it's professionally created by journalists like Dotty and me, but it's a lot of stuff, and it's helped create a whole new marketplace of information and advertising, and it's come to dwarf the traditional media. Just to give you a sense of the dimensions we're talking about, you see it in the graphic here. The New York Times has 9 million plus subscribers, while Facebook has 2.8 billion users. On revenues, it's 2 billion it's 2 billion in annual revenues for the New York Times, or 2.2 billion plus, versus 117 billion for Facebook. Pretty amazing when you consider that Facebook's only been around 19 years, and the New York Times, 170 years. And just to break the fragmentation down further, here's a look at what people are watching for their evening television news. In the 1960s, 1970s, roughly 30 million people watched each of the three main network news programs. Today, only between 5 and 10 million watch each of the network news programs. At least some of those additional millions who watch the three networks are now getting their news from one of the celebrities who have come to dominate cable news, people like Tucker Carlson, Rachel Maddow, Anderson Cooper. Now, those who aren't watching TV news or a cable news celebrity could very well be streaming movies and comedy series on YouTube, Netflix, Hulu, Prime Video, and so on. They're doing that from the comfort of their homes, in front of a big screen television, not like the pre-2000s when people went out once a week or every 2 weeks to go to a movie theater and watch a movie. As you can see, streaming and cable have taken a huge chunk out of broadcast television. There's yet another wrinkle to the business upheaval of newspapers, which Dotty will explain.
So this is a slide of Alden Capital, and on the left you can see what happened when they bought the Denver Post. Newspapers became so unprofitable, so cheap, that buyers, particularly hedge funds, stepped in to acquire them. Alden Global Capital now owns 109 newspapers, including 9 big city papers that it bought last year from the Tribune Company. It is the second largest owner of news organizations in the country after Gannett. Alden is known for laying off staff and shrinking the news hole to cut costs and jack up profits. In so doing, they are giving readers less and less news. They also save money by filling your so-called local paper with news that actually comes from other communities, stories in which you likely have little interest. That's what has happened in suburban Philadelphia, where many of the once independently owned newspapers that ring the city are now all owned by Alden. Their news divisions, by the way, are called Media News Group and Digital First, so you might have heard those words rather than Alden. Looking at TV, a group called Sinclair Broadcasting owns or operates 185 TV stations in 86 markets. It's the largest owner of local TV stations in the United States. In 2018, a controversy emerged after it ordered its news anchors around the country to all read the same script about bias, so-called bias and false news in the media. They only had to put the name of their community station into this script. And part of what the announcers read was this: our greatest responsibility is to serve our, then they'd put in the name of their community. We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that our station produces. But what we're concerned about, this is the continuing what they had to read, but we're concerned about the troubling trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country. The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. That was the end of their statement. While many news outlets jumped on this as revealing Sinclair's political bias, the company itself said it did it for business reasons, as a way to gain more viewers by emphasizing that they should trust their local news. Quote, people believe our decisions are politically motivated when the reality is that we are driven by what we believe is the best interest of our business, a Sinclair spokesman said. Whatever you want to believe about this, it shows the power that such a large organization can have over all the news outlets it owns and the millions of people who tune in. In another amalgamation of media, AT&T in 2016 bought CNN. Then in 2019, it spun CNN off into the Warner Media Group. And last April, Warner Media merged with Discovery. So besides CNN, Warner Brothers Discovery, as it's now called, owns more than 60 cable stations, including HBO, Discovery, CNN, several sports channels, a couple of food channels, and many you haven't heard of. On the social media front, we're also seeing consolidation, even as more and more digital news providers spring up. Facebook, for instance, now owns WhatsApp and Instagram and has renamed its empire Meta. BuzzFeed in 2020 bought the Huffington Post, and then in 2021 went public as a way to raise money to get even bigger. Unfortunately for them, the IPO was not very successful, and its share price dropped from $10 to $1.56 as of last Friday. However, the fact that a news organization that was born digitally, or digital native as it's called, could go public like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Gannett shows that there's a future for more news organizations starting from scratch. The fact that BuzzFeed is limping financially also shows the challenge that news organizations have in competing for audience and for revenue. That challenge has contributed to the polarization and politicalization of the news. Some say that after the 2020 election, Fox News doubled down on its support of Donald Trump because it was concerned that it would lose viewers to the even more Trumpian Newsmax. And in recent years, Anderson Cooper has leaned more leftward, along with CNN and MSNBC, to continue to appeal to their most loyal viewers. David, what has all that we've been talking about done to the respect that people once had for the news in the bygone days of Walter Cronkite and Watergate?
Yeah, so one casualty of all this fragmentation and seemingly endless revelations of bad behavior by community leaders of all types is that more people have lost faith in longstanding institutions. I mean, you name it, labor unions, banks, public schools, big corporations, and yes, newspapers and television news, they've all been hit. They're all way down in this Gallup survey measuring trust in our institutions, just above the lowest trust institution of them all, the US Congress. Just when we thought things couldn't get worse, they did in just the last year. The US Supreme Court is down 11% from last year to this year. The top scorers in this survey are an ever more lonely group: small business, the military, and police. The sad result of this erosion of trust in major institutions is that lots of people don't believe anything they read in the news media or hear from politicians. We saw an extreme example of this with the rise of QAnon over the last couple of years, with their endless conspiracy theories about COVID and secret cabals taking over the US and other places. Once people have lost trust in in an institution, it's very difficult usually to convince them of anything. Our journalism school classmate pictured here, Alan Ehrenholt, spent his career covering politics for the Congressional Quarterly and Governing Magazine. And he put it succinctly in his chapter in our book. He said, fact-checking operations, quote, do not persuade many of those who have come to mistrust mainstream journalism. Marty Barron, former executive editor of the Washington Post, sums up the problem this way. If you have a society where people can't agree on the basic facts, how do you have a functioning democracy? You've got it here. So actually, yeah, you've got it here.
Sorry.
So as we see here, about half of Americans get their news on social.
Sorry about that. No, I think you're missing some of the slide here. Can you see that whole, can you see the whole slide? Or are we missing type at the beginning of the sentence?
Missing type.
Yeah, hang on a second. Let me see if I can fix it. There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
So Marty Barron's question rings even louder when you come to understand the influence of social media on our news consumption habits. With half of all Americans now saying they get their news from social media, you can see from adding the two darkest red shades on the slide here in the bottom, which are people who get their news often or sometimes on social media. That means they are getting at least some of their information from places like QAnon, white supremacy groups, and far right and far left sources of all types, information that comes in without any filters. When you drill down further on the data about where people get their news, you find something very significant about political news, which is the news that is, this is the news that's creating so much polarization in the country. And it shows that 1 in 5 Americans get their political news primarily from social media. The 16% who are getting their news from cable TV are also likely getting a highly partisan interpretation. So the fragmentation allows people to find sites and groups they feel compatible with, but from a news point of view, it leads to serious distortions. So we're going to talk in just a little bit about some of the new digital news publications that are trying to be the new Washington Post and New York Times of our time. But if you look at this graphic here, you'll see just how entrenched the social media of the last 20 years have become in the news consumption habits of their users. You can see with Facebook and YouTube in particular, huge percentages of Americans are using these sites, and sizable numbers of those people are regularly getting their news in the process. Now, we need to mention that among all those posts on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram by ordinary people and celebrities alike, user-generated content, as it's come to be known, it sometimes does have a place, and an important place. The most compelling images of the murder of George Floyd were captured by Darnella Frazier, a teenager using her cell phone. And you can see her here capturing the murder on her cell phone, the third from the right. Her video went viral on social media, and she won an honorable mention from the Pulitzer judges. So at this point, I'd like to share a personal story of what can happen when sincere attempts to use social media to report on emerging issues get hijacked by the highly charged political environment we're living in. I started a blog about 12 years ago, and you can find it under my name, davidgumpert.com, because of a controversy that had taken hold between ordinary people who like to give their kids unpasteurized milk because they believed it was healthier, and state and federal regulators who thought this food was dangerous. The controversy became pretty nasty, with regulators actually raiding food clubs and farms and confiscating milk, like in the slides here. The one on the left is from Ontario, Canada, where local police and regulators raided a small farm and were met by a farmer on a horse. In the other slide, you see members of a private food club in Georgia being forced by local regulators to dump their unpasteurized milk. The blog became very popular and actually helped bring peace and sensible regulations to a few states, including Massachusetts and Vermont. My blog also helped launch a national discussion about a side of food regulation that had long been hidden. At one point in 2012, I was invited, together with a leader of a pro-raw milk organization, to debate the subject at Harvard Law School. Here you see a photo of me sitting next to Sally Fallon Morell, the head of an organization known as the Weston A. Price Foundation. We're debating the pros and cons of raw milk with a Minnesota regulator and a food safety legal expert. It turned out to be the biggest debate ever put on by the food law students at Harvard Law School, and it's been watched by more than 58,000 people in the years since. So fast forward 10 years, and you see that Sally Fallon Morell has moved on. Her book is in the lower right here. She co-authored this best-selling anti-vaccination book that argues COVID wasn't really a virus, but a mass reaction of people getting sick from 5G super high-speed internet service. So Sally wasn't the only leader around the raw milk controversy who moved on to wacko stuff. Here you see a photo in the right of Thomas Massey. This is how he looked when I met him at a small food conference in 2012. He had just recently been elected a member of the U.S. House from Kentucky, and he wanted to push legislation to help small farmers who produced raw milk and meat. Fast forward to late 2021, and you can see him on the lower left. You can see that Representative Massey has moved on from helping farmers to glorifying guns and violence. He put out the Christmas greeting you see here on Twitter a few days after a school shooting in Michigan in early December, in which 4 students were killed, 8 injured. It was reported a few days later that the suspect in the shooting, a student, had been looking up sources of ammunition while in school. So that explained Massey's reference in his tweet to Santa sending ammo. Presumably, he had given his wife and each of his children a semi-automatic weapon to protect against school shooters, although who knows exactly what he was trying to say. Why he and Sally and others, quote, graduated to more fringe causes is hard to say also, except that they seem to have a lot of company. I found my readers increasingly moving discussions away from food and toward things like vaccination and imagined conspiracies. So I've been doing less blogging and more writing in other areas, which I guess is a sign of the times. One question that keeps coming up with all the nutty content that's emerged on social media is whether the sites have some responsibility to do more to reduce the flood of misinformation. Facebook keeps saying that they are doing plenty, but I know on my Facebook feed, lots of crazy stuff keeps showing up about vaccines. Twitter did finally ban Trump after he got totally out of hand, but many of his allies are still spewing misinformation there. Earlier this year, a group of public health experts and doctors petitioned Spotify to do something about Joe Rogan after he put out misinformation about COVID. Steve Bannon has been banned by most of the major social media platforms, but he's found a new home on a platform known as Truth Social that takes advantage of all the fragmentation by broadcasting to hundreds of thousands of followers via satellite broadcasts rather than cable TV, radio, or the conventional social media. The latest is that Truth Social is on unsteady ground with financial backers and regulators. So I'll put a question to you, Dottie. Is big tech doing enough to regulate itself?
So our country is only beginning to wake up to the role that user-generated content has played in spreading misinformation, in fueling conspiracy theories, in boosting the rise of groups such as QAnon, and in allowing foreign powers to promote stories that benefit their political ambitions. Social media has been slow to patrol itself, whether to crack down on such misinformation, lies, and hate speech, or to ban those who gleefully promote it. The Wall Street Journal got a hold of internal Facebook documents
You
last
need to move
year.
your slide up.
You want me to change the slide? I don't think
I
it
think you need to
matters.
go to the next slide.
All right. Yeah. So the Wall Street Journal last year got a hold of internal Facebook documents that revealed that company staffers had brought very serious problems to the attention of management, but that little was done to address those issues. For instance, some public figures who generate lots of traffic on Facebook were being allowed to publish posts that might incite violence or harassment. In an internal memo, a Facebook employee stated, quote, "Unlike the rest of our community, these people can violate our standards without any consequences." Algorithms intended to increase connections among friends instead ended up promoting reshares containing misinformation and violent language. Another thing the Wall Street Journal uncovered was that posts of beautiful bodies on Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, reportedly were causing anxiety or depression in significant numbers of teenage girls, and that was something that Facebook workers knew. And any efforts to promote COVID vaccines were being swamped by millions of negative comments challenging their safety. And there was much more. In the last year, Congress, the FTC, and other government agencies have been proposing rules and regulations and legislation to rein in some of the excesses. Europe is far ahead of us in doing that. Just last week, the US House of Representatives did finally pass an antitrust package that would give federal enforcers more resources to crack down on anti-competitive behavior, but broader efforts targeting big tech, especially a bill that would prevent Amazon and others from favoring their own products, have stalled in Congress. Also, the House committee investigating January 6th has subpoenaed records from Twitter, Facebook, and others related to the spread of misinformation, efforts to overturn the 2020 election, domestic extremism, and foreign influence in that 2020 election. But who knows at this point, or whatever will happen. We just don't know where all this will end up. So David, is there some good news that is rising from the ashes?
Exactly. Any good news? Not.
There actually is some good news, or encouraging news. A number of the name brands of the news media, places like the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others, have found a level of financial footing in the online world and have learned how to compete in an industry that is no longer a bunch of monopolies. They are phasing out their print publications and going increasingly to online distribution. They've also learned how to slice and dice news of special interest to add revenue, such as New York Times subscriptions to for puzzles and recipes, all those Wordles that we're all looking at early each morning. In addition, a whole new generation of online news publications have sprung up in recent years. Places like Vox, Airmail, Grid, and Axios. And some sites have bravely offered news to citizens of countries where news is censored. Most notable is the role of Telegram in the Russian-Ukraine war. Typically, these places seem to have raised a few $1 million in funding from private investors and venture capitalists. Time will tell how they do, but there are some encouraging signs out there. Plus, there's a whole new generation of online news publications. I'd say the most positive sign that we see here in this graphic is that newsroom employment for digital publications is on the rise, reversing all those down graphics we showed you earlier, at least in this particular area of jobs. So, Dotty, can you tell us about the current staffing trends for women and reporters of color?
This is, to some degree, another positive. Although newsroom employment overall is down, over the decades, journalists of color have made inroads. This is a picture of Marquita Poole Eckhart, a classmate of ours. In her chapter that she wrote in the book on diversity in the media, she tells us that she entered journalism school just after the Kerner Commission report came out. You may remember that the report was ordered up after the racial protests of the 1960s, and it warned that, quote, "Our nation is moving toward two separate societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal," end of quote. One of its findings was that fewer than 5% of the people employed by the news business in editorial jobs were Black, and fewer than 1% of editors and supervisors were Black. The good news is that has changed markedly, which has helped news organizations be more in tune with the communities that they cover. Marquita herself had a distinguished career, winning Emmys and rising to become a producer of CBS Evening News. However, she also points out that the representation of minorities in newsrooms today still does not match their representation in the general population. And that came to the fore again last year as newsrooms struggling to cover the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests around that looked inward at their own racial inequality. The Philadelphia Inquirer, for one, ordered up an audit of staff and coverage, at the end of which a Black newsroom consortium issued a statement which said, "If the organization continues to be a news entity largely curated by and for white people, it will never be able to successfully serve the city and the region." But as this graph shows, both racial and gender diversity have, for the most part, been improving, just not enough. So what you see here, this is race. These are numbers of newspapers that have improved their racial diversity over time. It says 40% gained racial diversity between 2001 and 2018. The red arrows are ones that went the opposite direction, but you can see this is dominating. And by gender, it's been even more successful in terms of more women getting jobs in newsrooms. More and more, it is no longer remarkable when a woman or an African American lands at a top position. For instance, Dean Beckett was named editor of the New York Times in 2014, and Sally Busby in 2020 became the first woman at the helm of the Washington Post. Nonprofit publications are also a new trend that is emerging and is giving hope for the future of good journalism. Major investigative organizations have been launched to fill in for the loss of investigative reporting at the local and national level. They're doing stupendous work, often in collaboration with the media around the world. One example would be the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which in 2016 revealed that politicians, oligarchs, terrorists, and organized crime around the world were hiding their wealth from the public and tax authorities. In the Center for Public Integrity, which was a part of the investigation, won a Pulitzer Prize for its role. Meanwhile, ProPublica in 2019 revealed that the Trump Organization was exaggerating the value of its New York properties, a story which gave fuel to the New York Attorney General's recent lawsuit against former President Trump and the Trump Organization. And in another more local example, the Texas Tribune has raised $100 million through philanthropy, membership, and events, and now has 50 journalists covering the state and focusing on holding powerful people and institutions accountable. Some major newspapers are also turning nonprofit. That happened to the Philadelphia Inquirer in 2016. After 5 different owners, the last one, the philanthropist F. Jerry Lenfest, donated the Philadelphia Inquirer into a nonprofit foundation known as the Lenfest Institute. He then threw in an extra $20 million to help its survival very shortly before he died. The Inquirer, among other newspapers, is also collaborating with newspapers that were once seen as its competitors to pool reporters on big stories. The Inquirer does this with the Pittsburgh Press. And David and I heard the publisher of the Valley News tell us that it was doing some of the same kind of collaboration as well. The Lenfest Institute in Philadelphia is among the foundations that have also supported something called NewsPack, which gives local digital startups the technological tools that some of the bigger news outfits have. So far, it's helped support more than 200 small digital news entities. And hopefully the public, seeing the crisis in which journalism finds itself, is more willing to pay for a subscription today to their local news outlet, whatever it is, and maybe will even make a donation. David, what else is positive?
Well, one of the newest and most interesting outlets for journalists is the ability to have direct access to the public through podcasts.
Yeah.
A news organization like the New York Times can have its reporters doing podcasts, but individual journalists who have expertise in a particular area can pull together can pull together the technical knowledge, can do their own podcasts, going directly to subscribers. Podcasts have exploded in popularity over the last few years. How popular? No one knows for sure, but on just one distribution platform, Spotify, says it has 4 million podcasts. As you can see from this graphic, well over half of Americans have listened to podcasts, with nearly 50% having listened to one in the last month. Here you can see the top 6 on, just if you go back there, here you can see the top 6 on Spotify. Ones most of us have at least heard of, even if we haven't actually listened. Joe Rogan, Experienced Crime Junkie, Call Her Daddy, My Favorite Murder, Ben Shapiro Show, and The Daily. Okay. There's one additional outlet for journalists that has emerged, known as Substack. It's based on a subscription model where people who want to hear from a particular writer subscribe directly to Substack. They subscribe directly. Substack, the platform, takes a percentage of the subscriptions, kind of like a literary agent in the traditional world. Substack offers hundreds of regular articles by journalists and others who are experts in various areas of politics and technology and culture. The photo on the slide is of 2 writers who had launched newsletters on Substack, one on feminist humor and the other on transgender issues. So one Substack writer you may have heard about, many of you will recognize here, is Heather Cox Richardson. She writes usually 5 times a week about politics, in the context of American history. Subscribers pay $5 a month for her letters, which are usually sent out in the middle of the night when she finishes writing each one. She's become such a star that she has a huge following of hundreds of thousands of readers. As a result, she's also making out financially. Reports vary for what she's taking in, but it seems as if she's earning at least $1 million or more a year. That's pretty amazing, at least for a journalist. And what she's doing is giving hope to lots of other aspiring freelance journalists out there as to what's possible. So we'd like to pose by posing a question, and that's the question we posed at the very start. Where do you get your news? Clearly, as a citizen and news consumer, it's become much more complicated and demanding to keep up with the news than it was back when Dotty and I started out as professional journalists 50 years ago. We've listed a number of options for accessing news and information, but we'd like to hear from you about ideas and suggestions you might have for how to keep up on the news when there are so many options and so many viewpoints out there, along with any other questions or comments you might have. Just give a wave and to let us know, or you can also use the chat if you'd prefer to write a comment or question.
Yes, so take a good look at this list, if you will, because I'm going to need to take the screen down so I can see all of you, because I've got too many windows open on my computer. Let me just rattle down this a little bit. Think about whether you are still trying to get your news from the brand name news sites, cable, digital, online aggregators. I don't know. I'd like to keep this up, but let me see if I can see all of you and keep this up at the same time. But if not, just take a good look at that list. Hang on. Maybe if I close my little talk out, I'll be able to do that. So go ahead, raise your hands and David will call on you while I'm playing here. Unmute yourself.
I'll just start by saying that I'm getting a lot of my news, especially political news, from reading Heather Cox Richardson, and as well. And I get a lot of technology. I used to work for the Wall Street Journal, and I've all long had an interest in entrepreneurship and technology. And there's a technology a newsletter that's on Substack that I subscribe to as well. I find those two give me a huge amount of news. I mean, they're picking up things from publications that I might not see, and so they're kind of filtering it and putting it into a pretty readable format. So saves me a lot of time. Somebody
Phil has a hand up. Phil.
Hi, my video isn't working, so I apologize that I can't be seen. However, loved your presentation. I have a question that's a little bit off the tracks, but I think you might be able to help me anyway. If I have an idea for a weekly TV series and I want to get it up myself, so I go and I get an account with, I don't know, somebody, YouTube or
YouTube would be a natural one.
YouTube, would that be a good one to get one? Anyway,
I mean, that's a good place to start anyway.
So let's say I get it up and I have millions, it goes through the roof. Let's just say it goes through the roof. Can somebody from ABC or CBS or somebody higher up, can they just take my idea and just boot me out of the whole ball game? Or do I have legal rights because I created it and I put it out there?
Ooh,
You know,
that's a good,
I would, yeah, that's a good question. I would just say that I think the marketplace really determines things. It's in you know, in the days when we started, I think that would be maybe a legitimate question, although there wasn't anything like YouTube around. But let's say you tried to do some kind of a newsletter on your own, and it became very well known, very popular. And then let's say, you know, the Wall Street Journal started picking up, writing a weekly column on what you were doing. They could do that. You know, and that same thing applies today. If you do that TV series, there's no copyright on ideas. They can't lift what you wrote and use the same words, but they can certainly do. You know, if you were doing, I don't know, let's say you were going to do one on feminism, and they could do one on some other aspect of a little different uh, angle on it. But there's nothing that prevents them from doing that. But I just say the marketplace has a lot to do with it today, because if you say, you said, you know, you start this thing and it goes through the roof. Well, there you go. You're getting a lot of viewers, and when you get a lot of viewers on YouTube, you're going to get revenue, because you get revenue based on how much advertising there is on or excuse me, how many views there are, and they start putting ads on there because they make money off of, you know, the wide viewership you're getting, and you get a cut of that. So that's kind of how it works. If some major, you know, some network or big cable station decides they want to pick up on it, I mean, the only way that would probably work is, let's say you know, whatever it is you're writing about, there's some news development that's, let's say, on, we mentioned feminism before, and there's some news development, some big survey. CNN might call you because they've seen the you know, the show, but they don't usually have an interest. They like to have the expert on there, so they would get you on, and they would have be plastering your name all over CNN under your picture, and that's kind of how you'd get credit for it. So that's kind of how things work.
if you're really lucky, or maybe, you know, if you might get bought out. I mean, just Wordle just took off by itself, although that is a more specific thing, than they may have had some patent on it or something. But I don't think they do. I think they're Wordle lookalikes all over the place now. But the New York Times did buy them up because they had so many followers. So, you know, that can happen too.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
More questions? I don't know if I can see everybody's hands.
Or questions, or any suggestions you have for, you know, how to make sense of all the news options we have.
I have you know, just unmute yourself and pipe up if you want, because
I have a question. I mean, you just mentioned, I also read Heather Cox Richardson. And your comment that she makes $1 million on this sort of shakes me a little bit. And it makes me wonder.
Shakes you. It's not enough, or it's too much.
What do you think?
It's more. I mean, I don't mean too much. I mean more than you expected.
Yeah, I just saw her as this hardworking Boston College historian who stays up late at night to provide us with all this information, which is, of course, in some ways pretty partisan, but still very informative. But the question is whether, does it not create a problem for how much we can trust a news source when there's such a huge financial benefit for the person or the organization providing that information? I mean, she's not, New York Times, you know, is paying salaries at least, and travel expenses and all of that. She travels back and forth between Boston and Maine, but other than that, you know, she's getting rich on this, obviously. Can we trust her and others for whom that's a primary? I don't know if that's a primary, but it is an obvious benefit to her.
I guess, you know, that's a good, I mean, an interesting question. I guess I would raise the question, or a question in response, is that who stands to gain from her what a larger entity, let's say corporation or special interest, stands to gain from her being so popular. The only beneficiary I see is her, and basically the incentive is the more subscribers she gets, the more money she makes, and the more incentive she has to provide good, interesting information. She's somehow connected with a group of readers, and it's that connection that really is her makes her popular. So
I'd look at it, I look at it a little differently. Why shouldn't someone who works very, very hard, who's very, very smart, and who can reach a lot of people who are interested in her, why shouldn't somebody like that make money? Journalists typically, a new journalist today at the Philadelphia Inquirer, for instance, is probably only making $60,000 a year, working just as hard as Heather Cox Richardson may be working. But we have, the economics of journalism have fallen apart so much that I think the reason that we see Substack as an interesting sign is that it gives somebody who is smart and is trying to do the right thing and the ability to make not only a living but make a quite a decent living. I mean, it just seems to me that our salaries that we pay in our society are so skewed towards things like sports and celebrities that it might be a nice thing for journalists to make some money. That's my view. More questions?
I have a comment. I don't know if I can be seen because I usually use my iPad, but it gets too hot outside. On your list, you did not include VPR, and I listen to the news when I'm making dinner. As I read the Valley News in the morning, I listen to that when I'm making dinner. After dinner, I read the Times and the Post online.
So you talk about National Public Radio, NPR?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess we would call that established brand name, right, David?
yeah, national.
Been around a really
national-
long time. So
national outlet. Yeah.
yeah, and of course that is dependent to some degree, less and less, but it's still dependent on federal dollars and a lot of private contributions.
Are you getting the Valley News? Did you say Valley News?
I do. I read the Valley News in the morning.
Do you get it delivered or do you
You
go
bet.
online?
No, I get it delivered.
I'm asking because I mean at Eastman where I spent time, there's been a big discussion. I've been going on for weeks now. People cannot get the Valley News delivered, or the delivery has kind of the delivery person, I guess, left, and they can't get a new person who's reliable. And so people are just very frustrated who want to read it. And I mean, to me, it's the message is just another indication that the print newspaper is really on its way out, and because it's just become so difficult to get it together, and I think the people who own them aren't willing to invest money in say improving the delivery service.
Well, but that's true of all kinds of businesses in the Upper Valley. You know that, the restaurants are having so much trouble and they're closed. So I don't think you could, say that's a reason to say that print is in trouble, but I don't think it's because of that, because every place is suffering from staffing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess Dotty and I talk about it sometimes. Print is in trouble for a lot of reasons. You're right. I just to say, they're just. It seems like, one of the things we kind of commiserate about. She gets, I think, the Philadelphia Inquirer. I get the Boston Globe, and we both, when we go away on trips and we want to stop service for, let's say, several weeks, they make it very difficult to stop and start. The Globe, if you interrupt your subscription for anything more than 3 weeks, you now have to, they take you off the subscriber rolls and you have to resubscribe when you get back and you want to get the paper again. I mean, that's just so antiquated, such a customer unfriendly way of doing it. And so I wind up getting into this thing where I stop it for I mean, and this is I mean, I won't get into which member of our family really insists on reading it in print, but I stop it for 2 weeks and 6 days, and then that way, but then I get extra copies coming. I have to ask a neighbor to pick them up, and it's really just it feels so at odds with you know, here I have and this on my computer screen thousands and thousands of options, and I'm worrying about getting this stupid paper that you know, delivered or not delivered. But anyway, I guess the point is that the print publications are just, you know, on their way out, and sometimes they make it difficult for themselves, or they make it. And I'm not sure. It's not clear they even want to continue in business for some of them. I think maybe the Globe or the Inquirer would just as soon be rid of them, and they can just focus on electronic versions.
I think they'd just as soon be rid of them. And I think you should watch the pricing of print versus digital. I think digital's getting more expensive, and I think print is getting even more expensive. So that they really want you to switch out. I don't understand how the Inquirer, which once had, not long ago, had 400,000 home delivered papers, can pay a guide delivery person to deliver only 60,000 papers, like one paper per block or every 3 blocks. I mean, that's really expensive. So I think that's another piece of things going out. Sandra, you've got your hand out.
Yes, not everyone has access to internet, people particularly in rural areas, so people are going to be cut off from the paper. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, I think.
So when I was working at the Inquirer and our Sunday circulation was over 1 million, okay? I was at a meeting where they said they're going to stop home delivery in the state of Delaware because it was too expensive, okay? And then another time, probably a year later, they said they're going to stop delivering the Sunday magazine to some distant areas because it was too expensive. So, you know, they've been their own worst enemy for a really long time, and a lot of it has been over the financial costs. So, you know, it's going to be tough luck on the people who don't have digital. They're just going to have to move into the brave new world if they want to. They'll watch their news on cable. They've got television, right?
I think part of the Biden infrastructure bill that passed is to extend internet service to rural areas. So I think we're going to see more options coming to rural areas.
I think that you've somewhat been framed in a way I would disagree with, because we can argue the aesthetics and the convenience of print versus digital, but economically, print makes money, print generates margin, and digital doesn't. And there's obvious reasons why digital doesn't, and that's because the barriers to entry of digital are so low. And the Knight Ridder papers and the others were very slow at figuring out how to build some sort of an economic paywall, or putting their digital content behind a paywall. And they have never been successful at making the digital model viable as a standalone entity that can support the sort of news gathering operations that you guys described so well in your presentations. That's gone. And I think the digital transformation you described is one thing that has undermined that severely. Another thing that I think gets way too little attention is consolidation in the retail sector. So if you're a Bostonian, used to be Jordan Marsh sitting across the street from Filene's. Pick up the Sunday paper, page after page after page of advertisements from those two. That was a cash cow if there ever was a cash cow. That supported these foreign bureaus, and that of course is gone. Sitting here in the Upper Valley, the Valley News. What's the 800-pound gorilla in retail in the Upper Valley? Walmart. They don't advertise, or at least not in any significant way. Walmart they have their brand out there. They have their presence out there. You don't find a Walmart ad in the Valley News, and I'll give you $1 just for the sake of that. And then the final thing I want to see, other change that I feel like that maybe you would want to add to your presentation, is you've had this trend. It's almost a trend of billionaires riding into the rescue of certain newspapers, and obviously the Globe. The Globe exists because it's a business that John Henry likes, and his wife apparently likes being involved in it. The Washington Post exists as a major competitor in the type way we think of it historically, because Jeff Bezos decided that he wanted to own that. And so that's a big part of the reality in the news business, is viable news organizations exist at the sufferance of the deep pockets, pardon the mixed metaphor, of these billionaires. And sometimes on a good day, that's better, I would argue, than corporate ownership by Gannett or Knight Ridder was. On bad days, it could be much worse. But on all days, that's what keeps these big legacy news organizations that we depend on so much still in the game. So I'm sorry to ramble on so much.
No, that's good. That's interesting. Thank you.
Those are really good points. In the old days, you also had some very rich people owning newspapers, like the Annenbergs owned the Inquirer before they sold it to Knight Ridder. So I think that's the upside and the downside of having a rich person being the sole person behind a newspaper. You might, their political views might be reflected in some way, and they may pull out at any moment. So there's a lot of that. I have a question for everybody.
I just wanted to add one thing to what Rick said, and that is, what you're saying, Dotty. In the old days, the media barons who owned the Boston Globe or the Washington Post or whatever paper, and had those pages and pages of ads from department stores, they were making money on those. Today, John Henry and Jeff Bezos, I don't think are making a lot of money from those publications. But what they're doing, I think, is using them. I think John Henry is using them. I mean, he owns a number of sports teams, and the sports section of the Globe is a nice place to have your team written up about. And it's I don't know, Bezos. I think Bezos has some political interests and wants to have I think especially when Trump was in office, he wanted to see a liberal voice, or a more objective voice, out there. But he could afford to do that. The other thing is that I think on the digital side, these places are beginning to make that work. And the beautiful thing about digital, from a financial point of view, is once you pay your once you reach break even, everything above that is pure profit. So that's kind of I think the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have shown the power of digital. They've really cracked that nut. I think other places not so well. Was there someone else who?
I wanted to throw out a question, which is, how many of you are producing news in some fashion, whether through a blog or Facebook or something, or engaging with others that way? Want to show of hands or tell us about it? Paul is debating whether to say anything. Looks like nope.
Phil?
Well, I am on Facebook regularly with my photographs. And so I have a little following of people that like my photographs, but I don't get any money or anything out of that. So that's one thing that I have. But now that I have your attention, I want to ask my second question. And that is, with the contentious climate in the world today, and the separation of all the political parties and arguing and contention and aggression and unfriendliness and all of that, what do you think on an emotional level is the repercussions and the fallout and the negative results from all of these newspapers going under? Like the lady in the rural area said, she doesn't get, she doesn't have access to digital. Okay. And I sympathize with you, Rose, who was it? Rosalie? I don't know. Anyway. So my question is, if we can't, get a newspaper and kick back on Sunday, a lot of people curled up in bed with the New York Times. And then we had Charles Schultz, I'm dating myself, as a cartoonist, and we had Gary Trudeau. To me, I'll just say my own opinion. I think we're by losing all the newspapers, we're losing the warmth and the friendliness and the hominess of something in our culture that we're saying bye-bye to. And your presentation today, added fuel to my fire about this, that it's too bad. It really is too bad. That's my own personal opinion. So how do you feel, and what do you think is going to happen going forward?
Well, I'll just say real quickly that when local news disappears, and there's some research that shows that the areas that's happening the most in are, as David said during the talk, are the ones that tend to be poorer, and it's, we have less, in that way you have less education happening in those areas as well, and less information. And this is, I think, adding to, and the studies are showing it's beginning to add to the tension in this country over what is real, what is not real, because we've got this information gap and the social media pressures that are pounding on people from different directions. So that's one thing. As terms of fuzziness, I'm sure it's true that we do not have as much of a common language anymore. Let me just say that. David, I don't know, do you want to comment?
I just want to say Paul has had his hand up there for a while. So I'd like to hear what you have to say.
No, my question, actually, just as a background, I spent my entire career of 45 years dealing with newspapers. I was working for supplier of the raw material, the paper. So I've experienced firsthand the decline in the consumption of newsprint and the economic hardship that it caused us. But my question was more with all this blogs and people starting their own websites or talks or whatever. What about libel? We just had the case of the New York Times that was sued by the I can't remember the name, but it was because they had published a false information, which they retracted immediately, but yet they got sued. So the journalist making the reporting has the backing of the corporation from a legal point of view. What about the blogger that doesn't have that background? And of course, we used to have the right of reply law where you could, the media had to publish if somebody felt aggrieved a rebuttal, and that's gone. So what about this legal implication of having your own blog or your own opinion page. Is that an issue, or are all these people, somebody making $1 million a year, I guess, can afford to have somebody on retainer? But what is the current situation on that, you think?
Yeah, well, I'll just say that for one thing, winning a case on libel or slander in the U.S. is very, very difficult. The laws and the precedent. I mean, we have the First Amendment. Then you have a fair amount of precedent behind that, which makes it very difficult to sue someone for libel. You have to basically be able to show that they intended to smear the person or speak. They had intent. So what happens, because it tends to be expensive to actually pursue a case. The cases are only pursued against those who are seen to be able to afford to pay if they're found guilty, if they're found liable. So that's kind of what happens. But for someone who's who's an individual blogger and or doing a podcast, you have to be careful. I mean, you could say something, especially about someone who's well known but is very temperamental. They could sue you for libel because they have money, and they could bankrupt you. So it's a tricky business. If I know when I wrote a book on food regulation, I was being critical of a prominent lawyer in the field who was suing corporations. What I thought was pretty, much, very, very easily, and very, very slim reasons sometimes. And I went out and I bought insurance for that. So you can do it. It's expensive, but I wanted, because I didn't want to be in that situation that you described, where someone could sue me for libel, and they'd have, probably would be very hard for them to win, but I'd have to then hire a lawyer to defend me, and then also if I did lose, I'd have to be able to pay. So yeah, it's a tricky business.
One of the
I'll just say one last thing, that the case of what's his name? Jones?
Alex Jones.
What?
Yeah.
Alex Jones.
Alex Jones, yeah. I mean, he just got sued for he lost for good reasons, but for some millions of dollars. I was reading he actually has a pretty successful business on the side where he sells, I think, vitamins and things like that, and supplements, and so he'll be able to pay it, and that's good for the people who sued him, because they should be able to collect, but it does come up.
Well, Peter Thiel, the libertarian billionaire, basically destroyed the website Gawker with the libel suit.
Yeah.
So
That's one of the
I
risks
think
out there.
Dimension voting machines would like to destroy Fox, but probably won't.
They may do it. Yeah, they may do it. Yeah. The thing about our legal system, it works very slowly.
Other questions, other comments? It's 2:30. We've really enjoyed this. I don't know. I know David and I, you have our emails from the folder. So if you have other questions, comments, suggestions to make the class better, anything like that, please be in touch.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Appreciate all the great questions and the interest.
Sandra, do you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you. Okay, thank you. Bye. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.